That night, the blizzard was so loud, Mike Carson could barely hear his own thoughts. He stepped outside his cabin and found a dying dog in the snow. He thought saving it would be the end of the story. He didn't know someone else was already searching for that dog, and they were willing to come back through the storm to take him. But what neither of them knew was that the storm that brought them together was only the beginning. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. We're so curious about it. And if this story touches your heart, please make sure to subscribe for more. Your support truly means the world. The blizzard arrived without ceremony, swallowing the Idaho wilderness in wind, snow, and silence that pressed against the cabin like a living thing. Mike Carson had learned long ago that silence could be louder than gunfire. At 63, his body no longer moved the way it once had, but his instincts, sharpened over 3 decades in law enforcement and 12 years in a SWAT unit, never truly slept. He lived alone by design in a one-room timber cabin crouched at the edge of a pine forest, nearly 30 miles from the nearest town. The isolation wasn't an accident. It was a choice born from too many nights when sleep came only in fragments, shattered by memories that refused to stay buried. Mike was tall once, broader in the shoulders than most men, but age and injury had reshaped him. Now he carried himself with a slight forward lean, compensating for a left knee that had never healed properly after a forced entry gone wrong. His hair was iron gray, cut short out of habit rather than vanity, and his beard, once black, had gone white at the edges, trimmed close because long hair got in the way. His face was all angles, weathered and lined, with deep-set blue eyes that missed very little. People who didn't know him well often mistook his quiet for coldness. Those who had served with him knew better. Mike Carson had simply learned the cost of speaking when silence would do. That night, the wind rattled the cabin hard enough to make the walls groan. Snow slammed sideways against the windows, erasing the world beyond the glass. The generator light flickered, once, twice, and Mike felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Power meant heat. Heat meant survival. He pulled on his heavy parka, the one with the faded department patch he never bothered to remove, shoved his feet into insulated boots, and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and biting through layers of wool and canvas. The beam of his flashlight cut a narrow tunnel through the white chaos as he made his way toward the generator shed. That was when he saw the blood. At first, he thought it was rust from a burst pipe or debris blown loose by the storm. But rust didn't streak across fresh snow in uneven lines. Blood did. The trail was thin but unmistakable, dark red against the white, leading away from the tree line and toward the fence that marked the edge of his small clearing. Mike froze, the way he had frozen 100 times before stepping into unknown danger. His hand tightened around the flashlight. His pulse slowed. The world narrowed. Near the fence, half buried in snow, something black lay curled in on itself. For one irrational moment, he thought it might be a discarded tarp or a fallen branch. Then it moved. A low sound escaped his throat, not fear, but recognition. He approached slowly, boots crunching, each step measured. The shape resolved into a dog. A German shepherd, large but gaunt, its coat matted with ice, its breath coming in shallow, uneven pulls. One hind leg was tucked at an unnatural angle, and when the animal lifted its head, Mike saw the whites of its eyes flash before it forced itself still. There was no barking, no frantic struggle, just awareness, pain, calculation. The dog's ears flattened, its lips pulling back just enough to show teeth dulled by exhaustion rather than threat. Mike recognized that look. He had seen it in mirrors. "Easy," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. The dog didn't relax, but it didn't lunge either. Its eyes, an amber brown flecked with gold, tracked his every movement with disciplined focus. This wasn't a stray. This was a dog that had been taught restraint. Mike crouched, ignoring the sharp protest from his knee, and swept his light along the animal's body. Blood stained the fur near the rear leg, frozen into dark clumps. Around its neck was a length of nylon collar, cleanly cut, the ends stiff with ice. Whoever had removed it hadn't bothered to be gentle. Mike straightened slowly, the storm howling around him. He could close the distance to the generator, fix the power, and go back inside. He could tell himself that the dog would find its way, or that nature would take its course. He'd told himself similar things before. It never worked. The decision settled over him with the same weight he'd felt years ago, breaching doors he knew would change lives forever. He shrugged out of his coat, draped it over the dog, and felt the animal flinch before going still again. Strong, even now. "All right," Mike said quietly. "Let's get you out of this." He lifted the dog with care, surprised by how light it felt beneath the thick fur. The animal tensed, then allowed it, its body rigid but compliant. Inside the cabin, warmth hit them both. Mike laid the dog near the wood stove, layering blankets until the shivering slowed. He worked methodically, cleaning the wound as best he could with steady hands, his mind slipping into an old, familiar rhythm. Outside, the storm raged on, indifferent. When he finished, the dog lay on its side, chest rising and falling more evenly now. Its eyes never left him. Mike lowered himself into the worn armchair across the room, the ache in his knee a dull companion. He studied the dog in the flickering firelight. The animal was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 3, 4 years old, but its face carried the gravity of something older. Scars traced faint white lines beneath the fur. Its paws were large, the nails worn short as if from constant work. This dog had lived a life before him. "Ranger," Mike said suddenly, the name surfacing from memory without effort. He'd worked with a dog by that name once. A good one. The dog's ears twitched. Mike let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Ranger didn't sleep. Not really. As the night deepened and the storm screamed itself hoarse, the dog remained half alert, head lifted, ears angling toward every sound beyond the walls. Mike noticed it during one of his own restless half-dreams, waking to find the animal watching the door, body positioned between the entrance and the chair where Mike sat. The sight stirred something uncomfortable in his chest. Gratitude, maybe, or recognition. He knew that posture. He had held it himself long ago when sleep was a luxury and trust was measured in inches. Outside, the wind battered the cabin. Inside, 2 survivors listened, each aware in their own way that the night had not finished testing them. Morning came slowly, the storm loosening its grip on the valley as if reluctant to leave anything untouched. Pale winter light crept through the frost-laced window panes, settling over the cabin in thin, uncertain bands. Mike Carson woke in his chair with a sharp intake of breath, disoriented for half a second before memory returned. The dog. The blood in the snow. The night. His knee throbbed where he had twisted it the evening before, but it was a familiar pain, manageable. What caught his attention was the absence of sound, no wind, no scratching branches, no movement at the door. He looked down. Ranger lay stretched across the floor near the stove, body angled toward the entrance, head resting on his paws, but eyes open, alert. The dog's gaze lifted the instant Mike stirred. No wagging tail, no sudden movement, just recognition. Mike pushed himself upright with a low grunt. "You didn't sleep," he said quietly. Ranger's ears flicked, but he didn't deny it. Outside, the snow had settled into drifts nearly waist-high. The generator had survived the night, but Mike knew better than to trust luck. He bundled Ranger into the back of the pickup with a thick blanket and began the long drive toward town, tires crunching over packed snow. Ranger rode silently, amber eyes tracking every bend in the road, posture upright despite the injury. It wasn't the behavior of a dog unfamiliar with vehicles. It was the posture of something trained to move with purpose. The veterinary clinic sat on the edge of town, a low brick building half buried by snowbanks. A bell chimed as Mike pushed through the door. The warmth inside smelled faintly of disinfectant and wet fur. Behind the counter stood Dr. Ellen Parker, a woman in her late 50s with steel gray hair pulled into a loose bun at the base of her neck. She was tall and spare, her movements efficient rather than rushed, and her face carried the calm confidence of someone who had spent decades making difficult calls. Fine lines framed her dark eyes, but there was nothing soft about her gaze. Ellen Parker had built her practice in a part of the country where animals were rarely just pets. She noticed Ranger the moment he stepped inside. Her hand paused mid-motion, clipboard hovering. "That's a big shepherd," she said, her voice measured. She crouched slowly, allowing Ranger to see her, assessing his reaction. Ranger held still, watching her with focused intensity, muscles taut but controlled. Ellen straightened, lips pressing into a thin line. "He's not a stray," she said flatly. The examination took longer than Mike expected. Ellen worked in silence, her hands firm and practiced as she checked Ranger's leg, teeth, eyes. She scanned for a microchip, the reader emitting a brief electronic chirp. The screen flashed a string of numbers, and then nothing. Ellen frowned, tried again, adjusted the reader. Same result. She straightened, pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose. "The chip's real," she said, "but the registry's been wiped. That doesn't happen by accident." Mike felt a familiar tightening in his gut. "What does that mean?" Ellen studied Ranger, who sat calmly on the examination table as if he'd done this before. "It means someone didn't want him traced," she replied. "And judging by his conditioning, they didn't just walk away from him." She explained what she saw in clinical terms: muscle development inconsistent with a house pet, bite inhibition paired with restraint, a gait corrected through training rather than instinct. Ranger wasn't aggressive, he was controlled. Mike signed the paperwork, paid in cash, and loaded Ranger back into the truck. Neither spoke on the drive home. Over the next several days, the rhythm of the cabin changed. Ranger healed quickly, too quickly, Ellen would have said if she'd seen it. By the third morning, he was placing weight on the injured leg. By the fifth, he moved through the cabin with quiet confidence, memorizing the space. He learned Mike's patterns without being taught. When Mike coughed, a deep rattling sound that came from years of cold air and worse nights, Ranger rose and moved closer, leaning just enough to ground him. When Mike startled awake from half-remembered dreams, Ranger was already there, a solid presence at his side. It unsettled Mike more than he cared to admit. He had spent years training dogs to respond to commands, not emotions. One afternoon, while stacking firewood, Mike noticed Ranger freeze, head lifting toward the tree line. A moment later, the sound of an engine drifted through the air. A truck slowed on the road beyond the clearing, idled, then moved on. That evening, Roy Caldwell stopped by. Roy was in his early 70s, broad through the chest despite his age, with a face like weathered leather and a gray beard that he never quite managed to tame. He wore the same flannel shirts year-round and spoke only when he thought it mattered. Roy had hunted these woods longer than Mike had lived in them. He took one look at Ranger and frowned. "That dog didn't wander in here by accident," Roy said. "I've had 2 people ask me this week if I'd seen a big shepherd. Didn't like the way they asked." Mike felt the weight of that settle. That night, as the temperature dropped and the forest grew still, Ranger resumed his silent vigil at the door. Mike sat at the table, hands wrapped around a mug he'd forgotten to drink from, staring at the flicker of the lamp. He understood now. Ranger wasn't just recovering, he was waiting. And whatever had left him bleeding in the snow hadn't gone far. The knock came just after noon, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the quiet like a blade. Mike Carson had been at the table, cleaning his rifle with slow, habitual movements, when Ranger's body went still. The dog rose in one smooth motion, ears forward, head low, positioning himself between Mike and the door without a sound. Mike didn't look up right away. He already knew this wasn't Roy. Roy knocked once, then waited. This was something else. Mike set the rifle aside, his movements unhurried, and stood. His knee protested, but he ignored it. When he reached the door, he didn't open it immediately. He listened. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, lighter now than the night before, carrying with it the faint crunch of boots on packed snow. 2 sets. He opened the door just enough to see. The men on his porch looked like they belonged anywhere but here. Both were in their 40s, clean-shaven despite the cold, wearing dark winter coats that hadn't seen much use. The taller one had a narrow face and close-cropped hair, his eyes hidden behind sunglasses even though the sky was overcast. The other was broader through the shoulders, his jaw heavy, lips set in a line that suggested impatience. They stood too straight, too aware of their surroundings. Mike recognized the type immediately. Not law enforcement, but adjacent. "Mr. Carson," the taller man said, voice calm, rehearsed. "Sorry to bother you." Mike rested one hand on the doorframe. "You already are." The man smiled thinly. "We're looking for a dog. German Shepherd, black and tan, answers to Ranger." At the sound of his name, Ranger's muscles tightened. He didn't move forward. He didn't retreat. He simply watched, every ounce of him coiled and ready. Mike felt a cold clarity settle over him, the kind he hadn't experienced in years. "You're on private property," Mike said, "and you're done here." The broader man shifted his weight, impatience flashing across his face. "We're just trying to recover company property." Mike let out a quiet breath. "Funny. Last I checked, living things aren't property." The taller man removed his sunglasses, revealing pale gray eyes that assessed Mike with unsettling precision. "This animal belongs to an organization you don't want to involve yourself with. We can make this easy." Mike laughed once, short and humorless. "You already made it hard when you left him bleeding in my snow." Silence stretched between them. Ranger took one step forward, not aggressive, protective. The broader man's hand twitched near his coat pocket, then stilled. He wasn't stupid. He could read a situation. "He's trained," the taller man said quietly. "Dangerous. You don't know what you're dealing with." Mike met his gaze without blinking. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with." The men exchanged a look. The taller one nodded, as if confirming something. "We'll be in touch," he said. "This doesn't end here." Mike didn't respond. He closed the door slowly, deliberately, locking it with a solid click. Only then did he release the breath he'd been holding. Ranger turned to him, eyes searching his face. Mike rested a hand on the dog's neck, feeling the steady strength beneath the fur. "They're not coming back today," he said, more to himself than to Ranger, but he knew better than to believe it fully. That night the cabin felt smaller. Mike sat awake long after the fire burned low, memories surfacing unbidden, doors kicked in, faces frozen in shock, orders given and followed. He had left that life behind, convinced solitude would keep him safe. Now it seemed the past had found a new way in. Ranger lay near the door, head resting on his paws, eyes open. He didn't sleep. Neither did Mike. The second storm announced itself with a pressure drop so sudden Mike felt it in his bones before the radio crackled to life. The voice on the emergency channel was thin and distorted, warning of whiteout conditions and winds strong enough to bring down trees, then dissolving into static. Mike shut the radio off and stood at the window, watching the sky darken hours earlier than it should have. Ranger stood beside him, rigid, ears angled toward the forest, as if listening to something beyond human hearing. Mike had spent his life recognizing patterns, and this one was familiar. Trouble rarely came once. It circled back. By late afternoon, the snow was falling hard, thick flakes driven sideways by gusts that rattled the cabin walls. Mike pulled on his coat and stepped outside to secure the generator shed and fuel cans. He moved carefully, favoring his bad knee, but the ground was slick beneath fresh accumulation. Ranger followed him without command, staying just behind his left leg, close enough that Mike could feel the dog's warmth even through layers of clothing. Halfway back to the cabin, a sharp crack split the air. A pine limb, heavy with ice, snapped overhead. Mike looked up too late. The limb crashed down several yards away, sending a shock through the ground. He twisted instinctively, his knee buckling as his boot slid out from under him. Pain flared white-hot, stealing his breath as he went down hard into the snow. For a moment, all he could hear was the wind and the pounding of his own heart. He tried to move. His leg didn't respond. Panic threatened to rise, but years of training forced it down. Assess, breathe. Ranger was there instantly, circling once, then planting himself at Mike's side. The dog nosed at Mike's shoulder, then at his hand, whining softly. Not fear, but urgency. "Easy," Mike muttered through clenched teeth. He pushed himself up on one elbow, only to collapse back as the pain surged again. Snow was already collecting on his coat, melting, soaking through. The cold would win if he stayed down. Ranger moved away a few steps, then returned, gripping the sleeve of Mike's coat gently, tugging. The message was unmistakable. "Get up." Mike gritted his teeth and crawled, inch by inch, using Ranger's solid frame as leverage when he could. The dog adjusted instinctively, bracing himself, shifting his weight to support without pulling too hard. It took long minutes to reach the porch. By the time Mike dragged himself inside, his hands were numb and his breath came in ragged gasps. He slammed the door shut and leaned against it, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor. Ranger stood between him and the door, chest heaving, eyes fixed forward. The storm intensified as night fell, the wind screaming like something alive. Mike wrapped his knee and swallowed painkillers dry, his hands shaking more from adrenaline than cold. He didn't notice the sound at first, the low hum beneath the wind, barely audible. Ranger did. The dog's head lifted, body going taut. Then came the crunch of tires on packed snow. Headlights swept briefly across the small window before cutting out. Mike's blood ran cold. He reached for the rifle leaning against the wall, his movements slow but deliberate. Outside, a door opened, then another. Voices carried faintly through the storm, muffled but unmistakably human. The same cadence he'd heard days before. They had come back using the weather as cover. Ranger emitted a low, vibrating growl that Mike felt in his chest. "No," Mike whispered, more plea than command. He didn't need Ranger charging outside injured men into the dark. He needed time. He flicked off the lights, plunging the cabin into shadow, broken only by the dull glow of the stove. The footsteps drew closer. A knock sounded, not polite this time, but sharp, demanding. Mike didn't answer. The handle rattled once. Ranger shifted, placing himself squarely between Mike and the door, muscles coiled. Mike raised the rifle, resting it against the table to steady his aim. The door didn't open. Instead, a sudden commotion erupted to the side of the clearing. A large shape burst from the trees. A deer, panicked, dragging something that clattered and snapped against branches. The men outside cursed, scrambling back as the animal barreled past, disappearing into the storm. In the confusion, Ranger surged forward, barking once, deep, thunderous. The sound echoed across the clearing, a warning more than an attack. One of the men shouted something Mike couldn't make out. Then the engine roared to life. Tires spun, throwing snow, and the vehicle retreated, swallowed by the storm. Silence followed, broken only by the wind. Mike sagged against the table, the rifle heavy in his hands. Ranger returned to him, pressing close, breath warm against Mike's cheek. "Good boy," Mike whispered, his voice unsteady. He knew this wasn't over. But for tonight, they had held the line. Morning broke clear and brutally cold, the kind of winter calm that followed violence as if nothing had happened. Mike Carson woke on the cabin floor, his back stiff, his knee swollen and aching in a way that told him it would never be the same again. Ranger lay pressed against his side, solid and warm, breathing slow and even. For a long moment, Mike stayed still, listening to the quiet. No engines, no voices, just the faint pop of the wood stove and the distant creak of trees shedding ice. He pushed himself upright with a wince and rested a hand on Ranger's neck. "We're still here," he said softly. Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor. By mid-morning, the crunch of tires returned, not hurried this time, not hidden. Mike watched from the window as a familiar pickup pulled into the clearing. Roy Caldwell stepped out first, moving slower than usual, his weathered face tight with concern. Behind him was another vehicle, a county SUV, its markings half obscured by road salt. Mike's instincts flared, but not with fear, with readiness. He opened the door before the knock came. The man who stepped onto the porch introduced himself as Sheriff Alan Brooks. He was in his early 60s, thick through the middle, with thinning brown hair and a mustache gone gray at the edges. His eyes carried the weight of long service in a small county where everyone knew everyone, and secrets rarely stayed buried. "Mr. Carson," Brooks said, nodding, "we need to talk." Inside, the cabin felt smaller with strangers present. Ranger stood at Mike's knee, calm but watchful. Sheriff Brooks took note of that immediately. He'd seen protective dogs before, but rarely ones this composed. Roy stayed near the door, hat in his hands, silent, but solid. Brooks explained what Mike already suspected. Reports had come in, anonymous at first, then louder. A pair of men matching the description Mike provided had been seen asking questions in town, flashing paperwork that didn't hold up under scrutiny. One call had come from Dr. Ellen Parker. She arrived shortly after, her truck pulling in behind the others. Ellen looked tired, her gray hair loose around her face, eyes sharp despite the long night. She examined Mike's knee with professional concern, then turned her attention to Ranger, running practiced hands along his flank. "He protected you," she said, not as a question. Mike nodded. Ellen straightened and faced the sheriff. "Ranger isn't dangerous," she said firmly. "He's trained, disciplined, and whatever those men were involved in, it wasn't legitimate." Brooks exhaled slowly. "Fish and Wildlife's been looped in," he said. "So is the state. There's a history with dogs like this. Private contractors, gray areas, things that got shut down years ago." Mike felt a familiar anger stir, but he kept his voice level. "They left him to die." Brooks met his gaze. "That's why we're here." The next hours passed in careful conversation. Paperwork was produced, phone calls were made. Ellen testified to Ranger's behavior, his responsiveness, his bond with Mike. Roy spoke briefly, backing Mike's account without embellishment. Brooks listened more than he spoke. When the decision came, it wasn't dramatic. It was practical. Ranger would be registered as a retired working dog under a special exemption, classified as a therapeutic companion due to Mike's medical history and Ranger's demonstrated training. There would be conditions, regular check-ins, secure fencing, no public access, but Ranger would stay. Mike felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was clenched. After the sheriff and Ellen left, Roy lingered. "You did right," he said gruffly. "Both of you." Then he was gone too, his truck disappearing down the road. That evening, Mike sat on the porch, knee propped up, watching the sun dip behind the trees. Ranger lay at his feet, head on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. The forest was quiet again, not threatening this time. Mike thought about the life he'd built to escape the world and how it had found him anyway. He didn't regret it. He rested his hand on Ranger's head. "Guess we're a team now," he said. Ranger didn't move. He didn't need to. Some bonds didn't require agreement. They simply held. Sometimes the storm doesn't come to destroy us. It comes to show us who we really are. In everyday life, we all face moments when it would be easier to look away, to protect our comfort instead of doing what's right. This story is a reminder that loyalty, responsibility, and quiet courage still matter, and that saving someone else can sometimes be the very thing that saves us. If you were in his place, would you have opened the door that night, knowing the trouble it might bring? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. If this story meant something to you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heart-touching stories like this. Thank you so much for watching.